questions. And some of the details I'm just not going to be able to go into at this time as the investigation continues.
Here's the rewritten version without headings, in a more natural YouTube true crime voice, while keeping every line and point intact. Imagine this for a second. It's a warm Florida night in early March. You've just spent the evening at Daytona Beach Bike Week. The streets are glowing with neon. The sound of engines is still echoing in your ears, and you're only a mile from home, riding your bicycle through a quiet neighborhood. Now imagine someone you've never met is coming up behind you. In just a few minutes, the life you thought was safe, simple, and familiar is gone. And by morning, the whole community is staring at a crime scene so brutal that even seasoned officers struggled to find the words for it. That's what happened to Brenda and Terry Van Aultman during Daytona Beach Bike Week in 2022.
One of the best human beings you could ever meet.
Terry was a supervisor at the Amazon warehouse in Deltona.
Daytona Beach Bike Week is supposed to feel like pure escape. 10 days of motorcycles, sunshine, late-night parties, and tourists packed shoulder to shoulder along Main Street. Locals and visitors mixed together in this loud, chaotic energy where engines are revving, bars are full, cameras are everywhere, and everyone is just looking for a good time and a story to take home. But in 2022, the story people still remember from Bike Week isn't about the bikes, the concerts, or the beach. It's about a married couple who never made it home, and a random act of violence that turned a party town into a crime scene. Brenda Aultman was 55, and Terry Van Aultman was 48. They were the kind of couple who had done what so many people only talk about. They actually moved to the beach to live the life they dreamed of.
I lost my best friend. My mother was the most amazing, caring, giving, loving, selfless person in the world.
Brenda's daughter said they had been living in an RV before that, and before that in Jacksonville, saving and planning until they could finally buy what they called their dream home in Daytona Beach about 6 months before the murders. They weren't just passing through for Bike Week. They were locals now, the kind of people who were actually living the beach life that brochures like to promise. Friends and family described them as happy, outdoorsy people who loved riding bikes, going out to events, and starting this new chapter by the coast. On the night of March 5th, 2022, Brenda and Van went to Main Street like so many other people just to enjoy Bike Week. At around 10:30 p.m., Brenda posted a photo on Facebook. Just the two of them smiling, looking like they were having a great night. The kind of picture that would seem totally normal if you didn't already know how the story ends. They weren't far from home. Instead of driving, they decided to ride their bicycles back, which seems like such a simple, responsible choice after having a couple of drinks. Security footage later showed them walking their bikes through a residential area, heading north toward the house they had worked so hard to buy. They never made it there. Just before 2 a.m. on March 6th, people in a residential neighborhood not far from the Atlantic Ocean came across a scene that didn't make sense at first. 2 bicycles, a man and a woman lying on the ground, and a lot of blood. At first, some people may have thought it was a hit and run, or maybe some kind of accident. After all, Bike Week can bring chaos, drunk drivers, and all kinds of close calls. Okay, but when officers got there, it was immediately clear this was no accident. Brenda and Van both had multiple stab wounds, and their throats had been slashed. Their bikes were found nearby on the quiet street. Later, the medical examiner ruled both deaths homicides, and even investigators who had seen plenty of ugly cases said this attack was one of the most vicious they had ever witnessed. News of the murders spread fast, and the details were horrifying. A married couple attacked on a residential street, apparently at random, during one of the biggest tourist events in the city. The police chief called the killings heinous and senseless, and said they still couldn't explain why it happened, or even whether the victims knew the person who killed them. For locals and visitors, that uncertainty was the worst part. If there's a motive, money, jealousy, some kind of argument, people can tell themselves, that's not me. But when police say a couple may have been picked at random, it makes everyone ask the same unsettling question. What if that had been me, walking or biking home that night? Investigators turned to one of the most powerful tools in modern police work, security cameras. Footage from around Daytona Beach showed a man wandering alone near the Bike Week crowds, then later walking through the same residential areas Brenda and Van had used to get home. On one home camera along North Wild Olive Avenue, that man can be seen moving slowly down the street. A few minutes later, the same camera catches Brenda and Van walking their bicycles in the opposite direction, heading toward their house. The timing is chilling. two paths crossing in the middle of the night, and we already know how that story ends. Investigators kept putting together more footage and tracking that stranger's movements around the city before and after the murders. It didn't happen all at once, but slowly, the picture became clearer. Enough for detectives to narrow in on a suspect. Within a few days, police announced that 32-year-old John Robert Messiaen had been arrested in Orlando, about an hour away from Daytona Beach. Investigators said he had arrived in Daytona by bus on Saturday, just before the murders, and left the city the next day. That only made the whole thing feel even more shocking, like one short, deadly crossing between a stranger and a local couple. The arrest involved a multi-agency effort with U.S. Marshals and several law enforcement agencies working together to track him down. According to the Daytona Beach police chief, Messiaen confessed during questioning, and investigators said they believed the attack had been random, with no known connection between him and the Aultmans. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and prosecutors later called the case a gruesome and random attack. Right from the start, there were questions about Messiaen's mental state. Court records show there were several competency hearings, and at one point he was found incompetent to stand trial. His defense team argued that he was intellectually disabled and said they were planning an insanity defense. Later, judges found him competent, and the case moved ahead. In 2025, about 3 years after the murders, Jean-Robert Messiaen entered a no-contest plea to both counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which means he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. There was no dramatic trial that suddenly explained everything. Instead, the public was left with what investigators had believed from the beginning: a brutal, senseless attack on 2 people who simply crossed paths with the wrong stranger at the wrong time. For Brenda's daughter, Sarah Turner, and the rest of the family, none of the legal outcome makes the pain go away. She has described her mother's death as a living nightmare and said that it still doesn't feel real. In a fundraising post after the murders, she wrote about how her mom and stepfather had only recently bought that house, finally getting the life they had worked toward in Daytona Beach. And honestly, that detail hurts. There's something especially cruel about people finally reaching their dream, selling the RV, buying the beach house, settling into a community, only to have it taken away in a matter of minutes by someone they didn't even know. True crime stories usually stick with us for one of 2 reasons. Either the mystery is still unsolved, or the violence feels frighteningly possible. This case falls into that second category. There's no big secret backstory here, no love triangle, no hidden double life. Just a couple riding their bikes home from a local event, and a man who, by his own account, chose them for reasons he could barely explain. It also breaks the illusion of safety we all like to live with. We tell ourselves things like, "I'd never walk alone there," or "I don't know dangerous people," or "I live in a safe neighborhood." Brenda and Van were doing what most people would consider safe enough, biking home together in their own town after a night out. And yet, here we are telling their story as a true crime case, instead of as the story of 2 people enjoying the beach life they had worked so hard to build. If you're watching this at home, it's easy to focus only on how brutal the crime was. And yes, it was brutal. But it's just as important to remember Brenda and Van as real people. A couple who loved the beach, worked toward their dream home, and took a late-night bike ride they had every reason to believe would end with them unlocking their front door. The man who killed them will likely die in prison. But that still doesn't answer the question everyone always asks in cases like this. Why? Sometimes there isn't a satisfying answer. Sometimes the only truth is that randomness can be just as terrifying as a crime that was carefully planned. And even now, Daytona Beach Bike Week still rolls on every year. Engines roaring down Main Street, tourists filling the sidewalks, lights flashing everywhere. But for the people who knew Brenda and Van Aultman, and for the locals who remember that March morning, there will always be a shadow hanging over those bright lights and loud crowds. A reminder that behind every big event, there can be a story like this waiting in the dark.